In this video I'm gonna talk about Fujifilm and my recent entry into their world of cameras and lenses. It all started recently when I was in Japan. To Japan I brought my main camera, the Sony a7 III, and the smallest, most lightweight lens available, the Samyang 35mm f2.8. And even with this pretty lightweight setup, it still weighs kind of 800 grams or something around there. And it is a little bit too heavy for walking around for hours a day, at least for me. So I decided to look into what kind of camera I could buy that weighs in at about maybe 400 grams, that is really lightweight and not too expensive. And what I came up with was this, the Fujifilm X-E2. The reason I went for Fujifilm was that I was curious to try this system where they have a lot of manual controls, which I love. Adjusting the shutter speed or the aperture directly on the camera, it's such a nice feeling. The first thing you notice when you pick up a Fujifilm camera is how well built it is. Even though it's made mostly out of plastic, it is super sturdy, and I mean, just look at these doors, they are so extremely sturdy, especially compared to my Sony a7 III. It's almost ridiculous. The whole camera feels extremely solid and the buttons feel like really high quality. It's hard to describe in words, you just have to feel it. Everything is just tight and solid. And this camera cost me 2,200 Swedish kronor used, which is pretty cheap, I think, even though the camera is kind of old, it's like 4 or 5 years old. And with the camera I bought this lens, the 27mm f2.8, which is the smallest and most lightweight lens to the Fuji system, and it corresponds to 40mm on full frame in focal length. So I think it's a great walking around lens, and the reason I bought it is because when you put it on the X-E2, the camera is small enough to fit into your jacket pocket. I also bought this lens. I wanted something with a little bit more bokeh for portraiture, and this is the Samyang 50mm f1.2. Super sharp, crisp, nice lens. It's well built. It is not too expensive. It's manual focus, of course, but I don't see that as a huge issue. As long as your subject stands fairly still for a couple of seconds, you should be able to get a shot. And we will talk a little bit more in this video about the focus peaking on the Fujifilm cameras, which is excellent, I would say. Anyways, these are the two lenses that I bought together with my camera, and the reason I bought all of them used was that I wanted a cheap entry into the system just to try it out a bit. And if I would really love the Fujifilm system, I might buy a newer camera and more lenses, but this was a nice starting point for me. And the reason I did not buy an X100F or similar is that it is more expensive and I cannot change lenses on that camera. I love being able to change lenses. Before we go on, just a quick comparison between my Fuji lens to the left and a full frame portrait lens to the right, the 135mm Canon. And just to demonstrate how big the difference is in size of the lenses for these systems. So I bought the Fujifilm camera and lenses just before Christmas, and then me and my family went on a small tour around Sweden to visit relatives, and I decided to bring only my Fujifilm camera to really try it out a lot. And the rest of this video you will see a lot of examples and shots from this little Christmas tour around Sweden. So I'm gonna compare a couple of aspects between the a7 III and the X-E2. I know that they are not comparable because one of them is a professional expensive camera and one of them is a lot cheaper and older, but I will try to compare the things that are more marked like differences in philosophy between Sony and Fujifilm when it comes to cameras. And one of the first things I noticed is how much more intuitive the Fujifilm menus and buttons are. Here on the Sony, when I want to zoom in on a picture I've taken, it's this AF on button at the top. But what if I want to zoom out? Sure, I can learn to find that button, but it's not marked anywhere on the camera. Fujifilm, in contrast, all the preview buttons for taking photos, they are lined up logically in a row to the left, so it's really easy to check that the last photo you took is sharp, and it's also easy to zoom your way out again. And this might seem like a minuscule detail, but it really does a lot of difference to the user experience when you have like 100 of these small differences in intuitivity and ease of use of the cameras. I really love the Fujifilm for this, that they have really thought through all the button placements and the menus and all the handling of the camera. Most of the Fujifilm lenses come with an aperture wheel on the lens, not the 27mm unfortunately, but it's really handy to adjust the aperture with the thumb wheel on the back. And I really love that they placed this wheel so conveniently for the thumb to reach, so you can use it with one hand without a problem. This is just one more example of something that is placed in a better place on the Fuji than on the Sony system. So it was really a joy to use this camera. For the money, it's incredible how much camera you get, and sure, the dynamic range is not as excellent as on our more recent camera, but for most situations it works very well. And even in low light, I think the performance was pretty okay. I will now show you some photos that I took over the Christmas holidays with the two different lenses that I showed you in the beginning, so you might see for yourself what kind of results you would get with this camera. So the bokeh with the 50mm f1.2 is pretty good. It corresponds to the bokeh you would get with an 85mm f1.8 lens on a full frame camera. So if you need bokeh for portraits, you have a decent chance to get it even with an APS-C camera like this one. And I really like the rendering of the Samyang 50mm lens. It's really a joy to use it. And here you see an example of a low light picture taken in indoors, pretty low light, and the camera still performs pretty well, I would say. Even at ISO 2000 or 2500 you get completely usable photos with good colors. One good thing about the X-Trans sensor is actually that it keeps the colors better, I would say, when you shoot at high ISOs. I also really like the 27mm lens. It is a great all-round lens. The focal length is perfect for all-round photography, no matter if it is landscapes or portraits or whatever. You can usually take a good photo with that lens, and even indoors in low light, the f2.8 aperture is usually enough to take a decent photo. Another thing that is strikingly different between the Fuji and Sony systems is the focus peaking feature, which is kind of a must-have if you use manual lenses a lot. On the Fuji camera, the focus peaking has a much narrower hit rate, or what to say, so you can know that what's peaking is actually really sharp. And this is kind of a basic need for a focus peaking system, and you can kind of tell that whoever designed that on the Fuji camera actually understands what you need out of focus peaking and has actually used it. And I suspect that the person who designed the focus peaking system on the Sony camera kind of doesn't use manual lenses a lot, because it's almost impossible to know what's really sharp and what's like almost sharp, because most of the stuff is peaking when you use focus peaking, so it's kind of useless, unfortunately. What I tend to do on the Sony a7 III is to just magnify the picture instead and try to use my own eye to gauge if it is sharp or not, because unfortunately the focus peaking function is not really that great. Another minor thing which hints at the design philosophy differences between Sony and Fuji, and which hints that Fuji people has a lot more attention to detail, is when you hold the camera vertically. On the Fujifilm camera, in the viewfinder, conveniently all the info about the exposure is rotated, so you have it at the bottom no matter if you're holding the camera vertically or horizontally. This is just a minor thing, it's not like the end of the world that you don't have this on the Sony camera, but it tells something about the attention to detail that the Fuji people have and that the Sony people seem to lack to some extent. Now I know that after watching this video it might seem like I love Fujifilm and hate Sony and that I'm gonna completely switch, but that's not true at all. I still really appreciate my Sony a7 III for the raw performance, for the capacity test, for focusing, and like the Sony camera is much more of a professional tool, even though the user experience and the ease of use is not as good as on the Fujifilm camera. I still prefer the Sony system, and I would probably continue using it as my main system. I think mostly because also the Sony system is full frame, and I'm not really convenient yet with using APS-C because I really love bokeh, and it's hard to get as good bokeh on an APS-C camera. And sure, you could also argue that I could just buy a GFX, which is medium format, but I would not like to do that because these cameras are really expensive, and even if we don't like look at the price, the lenses available for the GFX system actually don't give you much more bokeh than you would get with the Canon or Sony lenses for full frame, because the lenses that are out there still for the GFX system, they are not that fast. Anyways, these were my first impressions when trying the Fujifilm system for the first time as a Sony user. Hope you liked the video. If you did like it, please give me a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe because I will post another video very soon again. That's it, over and out.